Good evening. I'm Toby, Director of the University's Conservation Research Institute. This is a Science Festival discussion on the roles and responsibilities of universities in relation to planetary sustainability. We've got a fantastic panel here, and I'm going to very quickly do an introduction to our chair for the evening and hand over to her, and she'll conduct the rest of the proceedings. Just in case people are not aware, we do have two cameras here and we're filming the event. So it will be filmed and then edited and will be available for broadcast on our Institute website. It is not being streamed live. So let me start just by introducing our chair today. Our chair is Susan Watts. Susan is a science journalist and was science editor of BBC Newsnight program from 1995 to November 2013, having spent 10 years prior to that working in print journalism in relation to a range of scientific topics. Her time on Newsnight was characterized by extensive coverage of science issues on the program. Newsnight won a BAFTA award in 1997 for its coverage of the BSE crisis, which Susan was directly responsible for. She herself won the Royal Television Society Award in relation to her coverage of GM food and human genetic science. She has a degree in physics from Imperial and therefore is extremely well placed to be leading this discussion. Susan, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pascal. Well, welcome everybody this evening. My first role really is just to give you an indication of why we're all here and why we're discussing this issue. So it's grown in importance and in interest, I think, over the last year to 18 months. It's extremely topical. Just today, there was an expectation that Oxford University would take a view about divestment. They seem to have adopted what you might argue is an intelligent position, maybe not, of deferring that decision. So maybe they'll think about it again in May. But they've been thinking quite deeply for the last 18 months or so. It's clearly not there's no easy answer to this one. Other universities, Glasgow University has already made a decision to divest it from fossil fuels. And we're talking here not just about university portfolio investments, but also investment in research funding itself. So as Pascal mentioned, I've covered climate change issues for some time. I suppose it's surprising in a way that it's only now that we're discussing this. It's taken so many years really to reach the point where the climate change issue has moved from being a science and environment story to being an economic and a political story. And some would say that's taken far too long. But here we are now, and we, as Pascal mentioned, we do have a very distinguished panel of experts to help us with this evening's debate. And we're being watched closely, not just by the cameras. I think all universities will feel themselves to be under quite close scrutiny on this issue in the next 6 months to 12 months. So just to tell you a little bit about our panellists, to my immediate right, we have Dag Runa Olsen, and forgive me if I did not correctly pronounce your name there. And Dag Runa is the rector of the University of Bergen in Norway. Now, he's here really because his university asked for guidance on whether research on petroleum and its extraction is ethically defensible. This was last year. And he has been very vocal in participating in public forums on this issue in Norway. We will have a look at the statement that resulted from that plea for guidance in a little while. And to my immediate left, we have Nicola Padfield, who some of you may know is the Master of Fitzwilliam College here in Cambridge. Now, all colleges, I'm sure we'll get onto this, have independent endowments. So this is a decision that may not rest ultimately just with the university, but maybe with each individual college. And we'll be very interested to hear your views on some of that. To Nicola's left, we have Rob Lake, who is an independent responsible investment advisor. Now, Rob has helped to guide people from asset owners to fund managers on decision making in this area. he feels there's no sort of one-size-fits-all solution. I think that's correct in saying, and he's worked in a number of different countries. And he also has an interesting perspective on the Norwegian position, because he was strategy advisor to the Norwegian government's pension fund. And he is not the Rob Lake, the magician and illusionist who comes up on Wikipedia.
Right.
When you put Rob Lake.
I'm going to have to do something about that so that I come up first.
I think it's very clever. You've search engine optimised yourself to come first. And last but not least, Alison Smith, who is head of a department here at Cambridge University, the Plant Sciences Department. And Alison's research focuses on algal biofuels, so really a potential replacement for fossil fuels. And we'd be interested maybe to hear from you on whether divestment would make any difference or not to funding available for your sort of research. So the way I'd like to see things move this evening, we have only about an hour and a half, and it seems to us to make sense to maybe divide that into three roughly half-hour sections. So first of all, we're going to look at the campaign. First of all, we're going to look at the Norwegian statement. So and its implications, and I'll tell you a little bit about what that is, in case anybody here isn't aware of that. And our second section will be on the campaign for divestment. And what that means for university funding. And then thirdly, more on the ethics of research and teaching. So is anybody here aware of the Norwegian statement? Does that mean anything to people? You are. That's encouraging.
That's a relief that we do have someone who knows what we're talking about.
Okay, well, Rune can elaborate on this, but essentially the University of Bergen, by its own initiative, I think, asked for guidance from the Norwegian National Committee for Research Ethics in Science and Technology. And we were scratching our heads, and we don't think there's a direct equivalent in the UK. But this seems like a very sensible body who looked into the sustainable or otherwise nature of investing in fossil fuels. And after consulting with lots of different actors, came to a decision, which you can read their 22-page report, but the important bit is this. Nent, that's the ethics body, is of the opinion that it is indefensible from a research ethics perspective if the framework conditions for petroleum research and research activities hinder transition processes and thus prevent the achievement of UN climate goals, which Norway has pledged to uphold. So, they're essentially saying that if your research portfolio or your investment portfolio hinders that process, look again and think again. So that was, I think that's a fairly dramatic statement, but Dag, perhaps you could elaborate a little for us on what have been the repercussions, if anything, in Norway of that. I'm interested to know myself whether the university has responded or whether you're still thinking about what your position might be. Would you mind giving us a little bit of context?
Can I first of all say a few words about the initiative and why we decided to contact Nent? And there's, I think, to be fair, there's two issues that I think is important, and that is, some years ago, Nent issued these guidelines, and it's a national body dealing with research ethics. But this is the first occasion where they ever have sort of undertaken a debate themselves on how does these guidelines apply to a concrete research ethics problem. And I think that is that was in itself important, because then you really see how these ethical guidelines work out in practical life, in research institutions like ours. That's one thing. The other is that this, of course, when it comes to the petroleum research or research associated with petroleum industry, that's one thing. But I think we will see in the future a number of research areas that are, let's say, increasingly or increasing importance for society. like GMOs, nanotechnology, nanomaterials, etc., etc. So it would be of general interest to see how this issue was handled by the Nent committee, and how we are able to make the best possible use of the statement that they came up with. So that's really the reason why I decided to write to the committee and ask for their advice. Their guidelines or their advices, they cannot instruct us, but hopefully they will have had a very good debate and providing us with, let's say, helpful guidance in this respect as well. I don't think it's fair to say that what have happened at our university is totally independent of the statements from the Nent, but at least what we have done at our university since then, and the board has decided to, based on these statements, establish a Center for Sustainable Energy Research, which we didn't have up front. We have been working on the renewable energy from a more technological point of view, but we realized that making this transition that also Nent talks about, new technologies or new strategies for renewable energy resources, is simply not good enough. You have to understand the politics, you have to understand the financing models, legal issues and things like that. So we would like to have a let's say much more comprehensive approach to it. That's one thing. And the other and more general thing is that we've in our strategy that we are working out for the next few years, it's going to be approved by the board by July or something like that, I think. We've also embedded what we call responsible research and innovation as one thing that goes through all our research endeavors on global challenges. So I think that is also important because, I mean, if you do research on food security or on energy, on health and things like that, it might have implications that are unattended. And having a responsible research and innovation approach to it is important. And besides, there is EU funding that goes with it, so that's great news.
Okay, so that's very helpful to have the context. And if I could summarise, you've set up a research institute and you've helpfully formed a framework for thinking about this kind of issue when it comes up, and also maybe in other subject areas as well, which is all very useful. But have you actually responded on the core issue as a university on whether to divest or not?
Well, there's nothing about divestment in the Nent.
Yes.
There's nothing about it.
But have you?
We will discuss that in the board, then you have to allow me to say a few words about the context. It's the university is state-owned.
Yes, very
so
important
we do not control funds, as the university board does not control funds. But there are a number of funds that are set up to help the university undergoing or undertaking its research. And in some of these boards, we have a larger or smaller proportion of the board, directors of the board. There is the smallest one. The smallest fund has the university board members as their board, and in that board we've discussed how we can reduce our investments in fossil fuels, and also how we can get out of coal investments, and the investment company that we use today, which is called Storebrand. They have their ethical index that we have discussed with them, and coal is out of their investment list, and we're discussing how we can also reduce the other fossil fuel companies.
So coal is out?
Coal is out.
Coal
yes.
is out?
Yeah, it has been for some time.
So it is focusing on the others, oil and gas, and you're really at the beginning of that discussion.
Yes, we will actually awaiting an expert committee that was going to advise also the National Pension Fund in Norway.
Okay.
There was an expert committee coming up with new guidelines December last year. That it is there has been hearing, and it's going to be decided upon in the Norwegian Parliament by this spring. we don't see them being, let's say, can you use the word aggressive or forward? Or I think their guidelines is probably too, let's say, less strict compared to what we've discussed in the board.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, well, it's really useful to have that set out. Just to allow somebody else to speak. Rob, I wonder if you would care to comment for us on how you see the impact of the Nent statement in Norway. Do you see it really as part of just a decision and debating forum that's happening in lots of different places, or do you think it was a major milestone or breakthrough?
To start with, I should say that I approach this question as a complete outsider, in that I'm not part of the university world, I'm not an academic, and so I just observe the discussion from the perspective of an interested outsider, someone who's deeply involved in the same issues, but from a rather different starting point. And my first observation, which I suppose reflects what you said in your introduction, Susan, is that as far as we were able to establish in our very brief conversation just before we started this discussion, there isn't a structure in the UK that would allow an equivalent discussion to take place, equivalent to what's happened in Norway, and that might be something to reflect on, to think about whether it would be useful if there were such a thing. There are niche, it seems, rather than a body that's able to take an integrated view across the whole of the academic spectrum, as it were. But although it's slightly simplistic, it seems to me as sensible a starting point as any for a discussion like this is the old principle of do no harm, which you can apply to your own individual life or to an institution or to investment or to research funding or whatever else it might be. That's an interesting principle, but it doesn't answer practical day-to-day questions as to what you should actually do in a given situation. We get slightly closer to it, it seems to me, in what, as you said, is a pretty strong statement from Nent, saying that it is indefensible from a research ethics perspective if the framework conditions for petroleum research hinder transition processes and thus prevent the achievement of the UN climate goals. It might be slightly easier to make a judgment about whether any given piece of research or a whole research program might hinder a transition to a low carbon economy and to all the other things that are needed to stay within the 2 degrees centigrade temperature rise that has been established by the international community as a safe level. If we then go a step closer towards specific issues or specific areas of research that might crop up in a practical context, others on the panel here are more better qualified than I am to comment on this, but the oil and gas industry, even if governments take all those steps that need to be taken to keep the world within that 2 degrees C temperature rise limit, the oil and gas industry is going to be around for a long time. It's not suddenly going to disappear when a carbon price is introduced, even if it were a very, very high carbon price, which it might well not be, as the first one. The oil and gas industry wouldn't disappear overnight. I've got some figures here suggesting that if you just look at the International Energy Agency predictions, by the year 2050, we're still going to be using, this is predictions even within that 2 degree centigrade temperature rise, we're still going to be using 50 million barrels a day of oil equivalent. That's a lot of oil. That is going to need to be produced safely and efficiently. At the same time as it continues to be produced, we're going to need to accelerate very dramatically research into alternatives of multiple different kinds. And that perhaps provides some pointers towards the kinds of research or endeavour that might facilitate rather than hinder that transition that we need to go through. Research on alternatives, research on safe production to avoid repeats of what happened to BP in the Gulf of Mexico a few years ago, to avoid pipeline leaks and refinery explosions and so on, and to increase very, very dramatically, as we need to, the efficiency with which fossil fuels are used.
So we're slightly moving on to our third section, but just initially on this first thought about the impact of the Norwegian statement. I wonder if I could ask, as master of the college, are these issues that you're already having to grapple with, or do you see this as really as the beginning of a debate for you? And to what extent do you think that, or do you agree with the idea that collaborating with the petroleum industry or the fossil fuel industry risks perpetuating a status quo that 97% of scientists are saying is potentially dangerous for the world?
I think I have to start by saying that I don't think any of us are outsiders to the debate. I'm, by background, a criminal justice human rights lawyer, and it seems to me blindingly obvious that sustainable development is an issue which all of us have to engage with absolutely directly, and it's a bit sad if we're only coming to debate it now. It's fantastic that we're having this debate. As the master of a Cambridge college, of course I would say we have to worry about how our endowment is invested, and we've certainly in my college worried about it for years and had an ethical investment policy. There are no easy answers in this particular area, but I'm sure that we'll edge towards them. In terms of this Nent statement, I think I disagree with perhaps both of you about whether it was a bold statement, because when I read the Nent report, I thought a lot of it were statements of the blindingly obvious. So it is indefensible from a research ethics perspective if petroleum research hinders processes of transition to sustainable energy. Well, of course. I mean, how could anyone possibly disagree with that? So it's words slightly.
And there's actually an if in there as well.
Exactly. Universities should reflect on whether their research portfolio is balanced. Well, that's not demanding a great deal. Okay, so we'll reflect about it. Surely we've got to do a lot more than reflect about it. Research funding bodies have a great responsibility. Yes, they do. So, I mean, I'm not sure that it goes as far as all that.
So are there examples, either in your time as master or that you've been aware of previously, where the college has taken an ethical perspective on its investment portfolio and pulled out?
And pulled out, I don't know that I can tell you that. I haven't been master for very long, and I haven't known previously a lot about the actual decisions of our investment advisory committee, which by the statute of the college we have to have, and I suspect that's true of all Cambridge colleges, that we have a statutory duty to take our investment policy seriously. Of course, we have to maximise our returns in that Fitzwilliam College, which I hope you all know is a fantastic place, but it's not over-resourced. So, of course, we have to worry about our investments, but we've had an ethical investment policy for years, and our student body has been useful over the years in encouraging us to ask difficult questions.
Good, and it seems from my reading that they may be beginning to pile on the pressure, so perhaps this will be one for active conversation in the next few months. Alison, I don't want to leave you out of this. I wonder if you could maybe just give us your sort of couple of minutes perspective on whether you feel this Norwegian position alters things for you, and from perhaps your very particular perspective as a researcher in alternatives.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that Mickey's made a very good point that this statement, the first one, that it's indefensible if there is framework conditions for petroleum research hinder transition processes to sustainability. But I think there's a big debate about what would hinder. And just to put it into context, and I think Rob made the good point about the fact that we will have to rely on fossil fuels for a long time to come. And that is because we need power. And it's not trivial to generate the amount of power that the humankind uses at the moment without doing something with fossil fuels. As long as there is a general move towards more sustainable energy production, I don't see that there's a big issue there. The big problem is that fossil fuels are very, very useful. But initially, when they were first used or they first discovered, most of it was wasted. They used to burn off the gas from oil fields because they didn't know what to do with the gas. They got rid of the heavy fraction because they couldn't really easily do anything with that. And then over the years, probably what you might constitute petroleum research has basically led to the whole concept of refining, so that all fractions of fossil fuels can be used, not necessarily efficiently, but can be used. So I think it is a bit difficult to say that petroleum research per se is a bad thing, and we shouldn't do that. one aspect that you might want, that people often talk about is carbon productivity. That is how much benefit you can get from any one thing that you use. So I think unless we want to change our whole lifestyle and have these debates without our electric lights on and without cameras and microphones and so on, I think we do have to be a bit realistic about what it is that we need to do in order to move away from using fossil fuels either at all or as much. That being said, I do work on a potentially sustainable or more sustainable technology, and the context in which research in these biofuels or other renewable forms of energy is very important. So I definitely would agree that if the petroleum research meant that there was, because it's so cheap, it's so efficiently used, and so on, it's the scale at which fossil fuels are obtained and then utilised and distributed. Economically, most renewables don't get a look in, and so there has to be some form of either support politically or financially in order to allow renewables to be considered at all.
Okay, I'm interested to know whether you feel that were the divestment campaign successful, how confident would you be that you would necessarily see a new stream of money to supporting your research?
You mean divestment from the fossil?
Yes. Is it necessarily one pot or another, or is
no?
it
I don't think
it's
never as nothing is that straightforward, unfortunately. And actually, many of the oil companies and energy companies are actively, investing to some extent in renewables, because I think they can see, you could, even if one is completely cynical and says that they're just doing that for window dressing to show that they have green credentials. I think from the perspective of pushing through the renewables, the resources that they have and the fact that they are all, the majority of them are very large companies with very, very big investment portfolios, means that they can probably make more difference to the introduction of renewables than many of the more lower level research that's done in universities, which would be very fragmented. And in fact, I think it is really important in all of these things to bring in the whole value chain. It's not just the technological solutions, it's sociological and so on.
Does your department have researchers who are funded by, in alternatives, are funded by the traditional fossil fuel companies?
Not directly. I wouldn't say that. Most of our research is funded by the research councils, but in fact I've had some funding from an oil company for a short period of time. So I think we're very strongly encouraged by the government to interact with industry. So we would do that. And it was because I didn't work on bioenergy until an oil company came along and said, would you be interested in doing this?
Interesting, right. So I'm not ignoring you. I just really want you to have a perspective really on where everybody's coming from on the panel. Does anybody have a burning question for this first section, which is primarily intended to be about the Norwegian statement from their ethics committee and its implications, and but you can be a little bit more wide-ranging if you like on where you feel discussions are in this country perhaps, or your experience of different universities maybe, and where they are at. Anyone with a burning question, raise your hand now. No. Good, okay. You're not allowed to ask the questions. So what I'm going to do in that case, while you will think of your question. Oh yes, here we go.
So that's a question.
Could you? Sorry, I should have said. Could you say your affiliation?
Okay, sorry. Dale, Scott Potter, PhD student, also been involved in the Norwegian debate in Bergen.
Brilliant.
And I was curious, fascinating question to Bergen about whether this has also changed the way that one thing is sector sustainability, but another is whether it's changed how professors researching petroleum talking about their research and their involvement in industry? And secondly, a more general question, in terms of Cambridge and the UK context, where, as you say, the government is encouraging collaboration with industry, but does that then, are there debates within the departments or between researchers about whether it's okay to take money from this as opposed to that, or where the money goes, how that directs the research?
Okay, so did everybody hear that question, that two-part question? Yes. Doug, Runa first, and then I'll ask the other panellists to comment.
I don't know if this Nent report in itself has has influenced professors to think differently, but the debate in general in Norway that has been raised over the couple of last few years, I think, has initiated ideas amongst the professors to look for opportunities within renewable research or renewable energy research. The problems are, even though the Research Council of Norway funds substantially more now these days renewable energy research than petroleum, we see also that they would like to couple this to education. And what happens now, I think this is it's a bit problematic, because when we a few years ago established a master's degree program in renewable energy at our university, I was the dean at the science faculty at the time, and we established that. When we see those people cannot get jobs in renewable industry because it doesn't exist, but they get jobs in the petroleum research. It's a bit. I think it's a problem that, yes, we can try to change. There might be state funding or research council funding for these kind of activities. But Norway is in a particular position, I think, with the extraordinary impact of our economy of the oil, petroleum, or the production of oil. I think it's fair to say that 1/3 of most Norwegians' income is related to petroleum. It's a huge part of our economy. It's not at all easy to change. So what, if I can just make one more comment, I think what we need to do, and what the Nent statement really means to us, is we need to try to invest educational wise and also research wise into renewable energy. We have to have a long-term perspective, because we will not be able to change overnight when it comes to fossil fuels in Norway. Not because the domestic demand is not covered by renewable, because the hydroelectric power in Norway is enormous. But the export of petroleum, the export of oil, is so vital to our income. So we need to find other ways to have to have national income.
Okay, Nicola, can I ask you? Do you have a sense of whether there has been a raised level of discussion within colleges or within academic circles, not just in Cambridge but more broadly in the UK, or is it really still quite a new subject?
More broadly, of course, we are fundraising more aggressively than we have in the past. We are looking for money, and when we look for money, we are very clear that we have to do very important due diligence before we take what we take. And I think, in answer to your question, one of the questions that triggered in my mind was that it's not only the ethical questions which predominate, but there are also more pragmatic reasons that if you take money from certain areas, it might actually dry up other sources of funding. And therefore, I think this wider political debate is really, really important. We've got to understand why everyone in Cambridge isn't in this lecture. We've got to worry about why there isn't actually... You said, are we getting more pressure from our students at the moment? Perhaps speaking slightly out of line, I'm always concerned that we don't have more pressure in many ways. A lot of us old people look back on our days of our youth, and I welcome debates here. I welcome pressure to engage with this subject openly, transparently. It's really, really important. Now, there are all sorts of questions which we need to explore, we need to take the lid off a lot of
Okay.
issues.
Just I'll bring you in a second, Rob. This issue of engagement or staying in the discussion so you can engage, or removing yourself and no longer have a voice. I wonder whether you would draw parallels with any other ethical issues that you've been involved in. I mean, there are parallels with other movements. I'm thinking of the women's movement and others, where they've had this precisely the discussion: do you stay in and try to change the establishment from within, or do you stay out? Do you move outside?
They're incredibly difficult to evaluate, aren't they? My working world, human trafficking, child labour. How do you actually find out whether some mainstream companies, which I don't dare mention because the camera's going on, but we all know that they may well be downstream using child labour or human trafficked people. And the best way to start to answer those questions is to ask the questions. If we don't even ask the questions, we can't have the answers.
Rob, what is your sense of where we are in the UK? I mean, the University of Glasgow has already taken a decision, haven't they?
It has.
But others seem to be quite far behind.
Well, I'm doing a little bit of work at the moment with a group of investment institutions, which includes some college endowments in the US, where the strength of the student movement, and not just students, but more broadly the pressure that's being brought to bear on universities and colleges, is far greater than it is here, to the extent that they've asked people like me to come and try and help them work out how to think about it. It's very striking, though, so far, that in the US, the colleges that have decided to divest completely from fossil fuel are by and large relatively small, whereas the Ivy League universities, which have also, of course, been subject to huge pressure, those that have reached a decision of one kind or another, so far, have either decided to divest only to a very limited extent, which Stanford has done, a small number of coal companies, or not at all, in the case of Harvard and Yale. Both, and on to this question about engagement versus divestment, or walking away versus staying in and trying to change, Harvard and Yale have both been very explicit in saying that they believe, of course they don't deny the seriousness and urgency of climate change, but they've said that from an investment perspective, they believe that the most responsible and potentially effective position to take is to use their power as investors and shareholders to try to influence what companies do. Now, there's a huge debate, of course, about the extent to which action of that kind might work, and the extent to which it might be ineffective or a waste of time, to put it crudely, for a small investor to try to do that, rather than a very large investor like Harvard or Stanford or Yale. The Cambridge University Endowment is, frankly, in the scheme of things, a pretty small investor. And that's the kind of thing that would have to go into the mix when you're trying to think about what course of action is appropriate.
So do you think that you may have a stronger position staying in if you're in, for example, Cambridge University?
If by definition, if you take seriously the concept that shareholders have rights and opportunities to influence companies, that's one of the things that shareholders can do or indeed should do, then that's clearly an interesting start to an argument. Then if you're a relatively small investor, as even the university plus the colleges taken collectively are, or not so small in the UK context, small globally, you'd have to think about ways of working with other investors who share those objectives to join forces to bring influence to bear, which there are many opportunities to do. There are well-established networks of investors within the UK, within Europe, and indeed globally, trying to do precisely this, to bring influence to bear on fossil fuel companies, and indeed other companies, because fossil fuel companies are far from the end of the story when it comes to climate change, either the causes or the impacts. And so those investor opportunities do exist, and that's...
So is there a third way, almost, a choice, where you don't have to make that black and white choice about staying in or going out, where you can divest your funds but still engage in the discussion, or is that not really
I think
possible or worthwhile?
The critical thing to work out is what precisely you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to influence fossil fuel companies, if you're trying to reduce demand, what are we trying to do? We're trying to reduce carbon emissions. will divesting from all the fossil fuel companies in your portfolio as an investor reduce carbon emissions? No. Oil and gas and coal will continue to be extracted and burned, and the carbon will continue to be emitted after you have divested.
The argument being that you're sending a very strong signal, which
exactly.
Others.
But my point is that it's important to be clear about the objectives. If your objective is to influence carbon emissions, divestment won't do it. If your objective is to send a signal, well, the nature of your institution and how you communicate what you have done will shape the nature of your signal. Though a signal from the University of Cambridge might be quite an effective one. Who's the signal directed towards? The UK government is already taking a strong position on climate change. Can the University of Cambridge influence anyone else who is not currently taking a strong position on climate change? Those are the kinds of questions that I think need to be asked.
Anyone who wants to contribute or question or anything, please wave at me, because I might not see you with my peripheral vision. Still nobody. Yes, one brave person. There's one here, you first, and then perhaps you, and then there was somebody over there. Yes. Would you mind saying where you're from as well, please?
I'm James Figueroa. I suppose closest link is Transition Town Network.
Okay. Okay. Yep.
But I'm just thinking these are powerful companies, multinationals. So won't the petroleum companies just head out their own research, do it in-house, or find someone that will, because they'll offer them a lot of return, a lot of money. So what they just circumvent what we're trying to do.
Do it themselves, yeah. Any experience of that happening?
I think then you have to discuss what kind of research you're talking about, because I mean, if it's contract research, I'm sure that a number of, let's say, more academic universities does not engage in that to a large extent, so that's already within a company or other research institutions. But there might be smaller new universities that are heavily involved in that, and that could, of course, if they say no, that research, I suppose, would take place within other parts of the sector or within the companies themselves. I don't think that will lead to the research not being done. I mean, there are so many researchers out there, so that's for sure.
Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, that's for our Institute for Sustainability Leadership in the university. The question was just picking up on your quest for a third way, whether part of the reluctance of some institutions to divest is because of a sense that if they do, they might diminish their investment returns, reduce their kind of universe of people who invest in, which is, I can understand where they're coming from. They don't want to prejudice important returns which they're using for actually very often social purposes of one kind or another, including research. So just wanted to make the point really that quite a lot of investors out there have looked at this question and actually come to the conclusion that backing away from fossil fuel companies and those heavily invested in producing carbon emissions may be in their long-term investment interests because of value generating in other sections of the economy and the risks of having stock in companies which are subject to future regulation and future dissatisfaction. I think it's fairly clear that is on the horizon. So I don't know if that helps at all, but it's maybe not just a dialogue between divest or stay, but actually in the interest of smart investment, it would be a very good idea to get moving on this.
Can somebody on the panel perhaps clarify this issue of, I'm not exactly sure what the technical term, fiduciary obligation or your obligation as an investor to maximise your returns. Legally, where do we stand on that? Is there a legal obligation, or is there room for discussion about the ethical balance?
There is no legal obligation on charities, and I assume the University of Cambridge and the individual colleges are charities for this purpose, or on investors like pension funds, to maximise financial return regardless of any other factor.
So they can take other factors into account? They
can take other factors into account. Now the question then is which factors and under what circumstances, of course. The Charity Commission, and I happen to have, entirely by coincidence, a piece of paper in front of me which is an extract from the Charity Commission guidance on investment for charities, which says that the trustees of any charity can decide to invest ethically, even if the investment might provide a lower rate of return than an alternative investment, if a particular investment conflicts with the aims of the charity. So somebody has to make a judgment about what that means. Or, and this might be interesting in the context of your comment about fundraising, Nikki, the charity might lose supporters or beneficiaries if it does not invest ethically. Or, final test, there is no significant financial detriment. So judgments have to be made about the aims of the charity and consistency between the aims of the charity and given investment strategies, and what supporters and beneficiaries might think or expect, and what degree of financial detriment might not be significant, as it were. So absolute maximisation of financial return is not a legal obligation for charities. Same applies to pension funds, and the Law Commission has recently produced a report again saying that absolute maximisation of financial return regardless of risk is not a legal obligation. Where things like climate change or other environmental and social factors can reasonably be assumed to be financially significant, and there are plenty of reasons for thinking that multiple dimensions of climate change are going to have significant financial implications, then you should take them into account. Because precisely because they might affect your financial returns.
Yes, we're assuming that there's a detriment to your investment by putting out, but in fact, investing in an alternative portfolio may be beneficial in its own
divesting from all fossil fuel production would be a pretty big step.
What about this issue of stranded
when oil and gas
assets?
accounts for 15% of the FTSE of the UK stock market.
So what about this issue of stranded assets that there's much talk about?
Do you want to explain what that means?
Please, you can go ahead.
The concept of stranded assets is basically that if a very high carbon price is introduced or governments regulate to keep the global temperature rise to that 2 degrees C level that we were talking about before, some oil fields or gas fields or shale oil and gas in particular, or tar sands or oil production in the Arctic, for example, might simply become uneconomic. That was a crucial missing negative, uneconomic. The devil is in the detail, not surprisingly, and it's not necessarily likely, with one or two exceptions, likely to be the case that an entire company would be stranded. There are companies that only do tar sands, for example, and they might have difficulties because large proportions of tar sands would have to be left in the ground to hit the 2-degree target. But an individual oil or gas company might have an oil field here or a gas field there that could become economic. It wouldn't be a question of the entire company suddenly going under. So divesting from all fossil fuels might be, as it were, throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Or it's a rather undiscriminating approach if you're interested in that, specifically in that concept of financial risk and stranded assets.
Do you happen to know what the University of Glasgow position or discussion on whether or not this would
I don't,
end
off the
up
top of my
making
head,
the money or losing the money?
off the top of my head.
I don't know whether anybody else in the room does. But
A couple of other examples though. Yeah. Stanford has divested from a small number of coal companies only on the basis that coal is substantially more carbon intensive than oil or gas. And therefore that coal companies are more likely to find themselves with stranded assets than certainly gas and maybe oil. And the health sector workers pension fund in Australia, slightly obscure example, perhaps Hester, has done a similar thing. They have divested in a focused way purely from a small number of coal companies on the same basis that that's where they judge the most significant financial risk to be. And one of the Swedish state pension funds has done a similar thing, and the Norwegian government pension fund has also taken out a small number of coal and oil companies, but they haven't done a blanket divestment across the whole industry.
Thank you. And did you want to ask something?
It's just more of a comment. My name is Rune, I'm with the strategy office here in Cambridge. I see it obviously from a more central and from an institutional point of view. We often, when we talk to our academics, they, and rightly so, they say there's academic freedom, whatever they do. So as an institution, Cambridge, to make a decision or to discuss, we discuss a lot, but the decision may not be that our academics would say, I'd like to do research on this or that. We have, and now we've got actually a website, not that I'm advertising, but we've got an ethics website now in the meantime. There's this kind of institutional point of view, there's a kind of a minefield. So there's academic freedom, which we're proud of, but there may be issues that, because of ethic research, that is going on. So maybe it's just a comment, but maybe some panelists say there's an idea.
Maybe
well, in fact, that was a point I was going to make a bit later on in the
we're moving smoothly through the three sections, so don't worry too much.
So I think it is actually quite difficult to go. So that is a charitable aim of the university, is to allow academic freedom, and in many ways you could say that if you prescribed what people could do research on, that new discoveries would not be forthcoming. In a sort of more immediate aspect, then one of the main renewable in inverted commas, non-carbon forms of energy is nuclear energy. And there is a big push to do more research on nuclear power, because that's seen by various institutions in the UK, including Friends of the Earth, for example, I think have see the benefits of nuclear, because it will decarbonise very quickly the production of electricity. But there is not enough, there aren't enough people in the UK to be able to sustain a nuclear industry at the level of the much more modern forms of power stations and so on that have been developed in other parts of the world. So that is an ethical question in a way. Should we be supporting that area? Now, in fact, there is nuclear research that goes on in the university, and I would find it difficult to say that as an institution, we should say you can't do that, because that's not possible. I mean, in the area of plant research, then doing research with tobacco is seen as has a number of bad ethical aspects, because it supports the cigarette and the cigar and whatever industry. But in fact, there's a very big tobacco growing industry, which is often in developing countries, and their agriculture, parts of their agriculture, are based on growing tobacco. So some aspects of research on tobacco is to think of different uses for it other than as cigarettes. So I think it is quite difficult to say this is the only thing that is appropriate to allow researchers to.
If I could bring Rune in here, just before our debate started, you were talking a little bit about this dual purpose issue on research, and you had some nice examples. If you can remember on
yes, I can I make a brief comment with respect
yes, I'm thinking of academic freedom.
Academic freedom. Of course, we've got academic freedom, and I think that's the very backbone of a university. But it's also like that the ethical guidelines and ethical or the responsibility for conducting research in an ethical way is also an individual scientist's responsibility. So yes, there is a part of the academic freedom to do that in a ethical way as well. Coming back to your question, that is the dual use sort of knowledge, and we discussed briefly what, at least at our university, has been brought forward as let's say an argument in the petroleum debate, and that is if you do research on reservoirs and geology, geologists looking into the reservoirs where you can find oil, but you can also make exactly the same knowledge applicable to geothermal research. So if you would like to let's say expand on the geothermal energy resource in Norway and do research on that, exactly the same knowledge would be very welcome into the petroleum research, and I think that's barely. It's simply the very nature of basic research. And
energy companies in Iceland are funding research into burying carbon dioxide in the basalt rock in
exactly
Iceland.
The same.
So is it possible ever to, I'm wondering, Rob, whether you've sat in discussions where it's ever possible to clearly delineate what is fossil fuel research without there being some potential beneficial side effect of the kind that we're... Is it possible to make that distinction?
I haven't been involved in discussions like that at all. I mean, if you allow me to go back to the investment question, an analogous challenge in a way, if you're thinking about climate change in your investment portfolio, is to recognise the reality that it's not just about fossil fuel companies. If you remove fossil fuel companies from your portfolio, you will still be investing in a lot of companies that are consuming very large amounts of fossil fuel and therefore emitting huge amounts of carbon dioxide, cement, steel, some types of manufacturing, food processing. So you're still, if your concern is about climate change and the contribution of your investment portfolio to climate change, you're still complicit. And if your concern is about financial risk, you have still got financial risk, because if carbon is then priced, those companies will take a hit. So it's an equivalent type of complexity, as it were, to think about the different dimensions of the challenges.
Sure. Is there anybody here from the divestment campaign, either for Cambridge or anywhere else? Anything you'd like to contribute to the discussion about that sort of debate and issue there?
So, our campaign is actually not purely a divestment campaign. We're digging into these complexities, because there might be some areas in which it does make sense to divest, and others in which it might be more effective to get together with other large institutional investors and do kind of aggressive collective shareholder engagement, especially around, there are a couple of key points in which it feels like there could be some real traction. One of them is to get large, diversified oil and gas companies, for example, to shut down capital expenditures into particularly marginal extreme energy projects like those in the Canadian tar sands and so on, because there's a good financial argument for that, in that the capital expenditure might end up being wasted, as that's the first oil that's likely to stay in the ground. Equally, to get companies to disclose their lobbying activities as regards carbon taxation legislation proposals in various national contexts. So we've got quite a big active campaign, and the administration is engaging with us directly right now. So that's been very, very nice.
Okay, right. And are you also addressing this issue of transparency about the nature of investments, but colleges being, not necessarily just Cambridge here, but all universities, being open about what they are, what they know they're investing in, and the portfolios where they're not so clear, but they can ask those questions? Is that part of your campaign?
That's a huge issue. What we have been told, like this group has put out freedom of information requests to every single college and the university itself, and we've been rebuffed in most cases, in part because the idea is that it's proprietary information and it would harm, or it would encourage copycats to make use of this, of the investment strategies of the university or the colleges, and therefore decrease the returns over time. And that may or may not be a legitimate argument, but it's certainly a barrier to transparency, and we've really gotten nowhere. We don't.
Okay, thanks very much. So, Nicola, have you asked Fitzwilliam College about their investment?
Yes, I should say there have been several colleges that have cooperated with us, and some of them have cooperated with us as much as they can.
Has Fitzwilliam had?
We've had some very productive conversations.
They have had some very productive conversations with Fitzwilliam
No
College.
doubt those will continue. Rob, did you want to contribute something?
If the university as a whole, or an individual college, were to, as it were, take up the cudgels on the issues that you highlighted, namely returning capital to investors rather than investing it in assets that might become stranded, disclosing political lobbying, for example, disclosing how they would survive and how their businesses would evolve and survive in a 2-degree world, or in a 2-degree scenario in which governments take all the actions that are needed to get us to that 2-degree world, then the university and the colleges would be in very good company indeed. They would be in the company of investors representing certainly hundreds, if not trillions, possibly hundreds, of billions of dollars of investment. including, for example, the Norwegian Government Pension Fund, which has just published a very interesting new statement of its expectations of companies, saying, among other things, please tell us how you're going to survive in a 2-degree world, and please tell us what lobbying you are undertaking in relation to climate change. So the sorts of things we're talking about here are not actually terribly radical or scary. They represent a recognition of financial risk that many, many investors around the world have now arrived at.
Mm-hmm. Okay, anybody else with questions? Let me know. So did you want to come back on that one? Yep.
Well, just one additional comment. There are also usually local opportunities for funds of this size that we're dealing with here at Cambridge. For example, most of the buildings here could probably be a lot more energy efficient.
Students could turn down the heating a lot too.
Well, see, interestingly, yeah, so the behavioral side of things is huge as well, but also there have been experiments done in especially US institutions in which they've done these green revolving funds that kind of deal with buildings all in a blitz instead of being, making small changes incrementally. And it's much more efficient that way. It has enormous returns, an average of like 33%, which is much higher than any investment fund at this university is able to make. And it'd be interesting to see, for example, the colleges putting some money into a pooled fund that could even expand outside the university's bounds itself. So, there are things that can be done, especially with buildings at this age, that could actually decrease the demand for fossil fuels as well. So it could be a mix of strategies.
Did you? I can't remember now. Did you want to come in on that point?
I could.
Go ahead. While everybody else is writing down their questions, go ahead.
A few questions ago, you asked a question about Glasgow University.
Yes.
And I wrote down what they said, because again, as a sort of forward-looking university, if you think about the words, I don't think it sounds as brave as we're holding it out to be. The university recognises the devastating impact that climate change may have on our planet and the need for the world to reduce its dependence on fossil fuels. Over the coming years, we will steadily reduce our investment in the fossil fuel extraction industry, while also taking steps to reduce our carbon consumption.
Right. Steady as she goes, slowly and steadily. Yes, quite a lot of room for interpretation about this pace of change there.
And a question that I had, I think you hinted a little bit earlier that our government was doing marvellous things. And
I'm not sure I used the word marvellous.
No, you didn't use those words at all. But I do wonder whether, as responsible citizens, we should be asking the question whether our policymakers should be doing more for this third way that you suggest, to make it in our interests to invest in certain areas and not in other areas. It seems to me that a lot more could be being done.
Yeah. I'm very interested in the parallels with our experience of the tobacco industry, and thinking, lots of learned books have been written about the nature of that campaign, but the divestment campaign there, the court cases that revealed the documents about the medical knowledge and stated knowledge at which point. Are there take-home lessons that could be applied to where we are with this? From the bubble up from the tobacco.
I'd come back to what I said before. The Glasgow statement is ringing and resounding and very strong and so forth. But the challenge back to them is, do they actually believe, can they demonstrate how divesting from fossil fuel is going to help to address climate change? It might. I'm not at all saying divestment is inappropriate. I'm saying that each institution has to be clear about its objectives. It was motherhood and apple pie, I suppose, in a sense, what I'm saying. Be clear about your objectives and test any potential course of action against those objectives. To what extent do we have some sort of assurance that the action we're taking will be effective in contributing to that objective, given our mission and the stakeholder pressures we face and so forth? So, and personally, I'm not convinced that for an institution, blanket divestment, addresses the issue of climate change as effectively as a range of other actions that an institution might take would or could, including the sorts of policy things that we've talked about.
Okay, so we do have a question over here. Yeah.
It's not so much a question, just a comment to say, do you not think that simply by Glasgow University making that statement and committing in public to say that they are going to do that, that's sending a really strong signal to other university institutions for other people to say, look at what Glasgow have done, we can do this too. It's kind of a making it possible sort of thing that will encourage other people to do the same and feel like they can.
I think it's a really important part of the concept, and it relates to your tobacco question, is that a central part of what they're saying there is that they are taking steps to reduce our carbon consumption. And I think the tobacco parallel is quite clearly very strong government leadership to reduce demand.
Yeah.
Would anybody else like to comment on this side? I'm slightly neglecting over here. Either on the signals that are sent by the strength of signals, do they matter? Can they change anything from your experience?
Well, up to you.
Yeah. Okay. I think signals are important, but it depends on from whom the signals are coming from. I won't comment upon the University of Glasgow when it comes to science and impact in society, but I'm pretty sure that if the Ivy League top universities went together, teamed up together and sent signals, that would have a much huger impact than at least a small university in Norway. I think perhaps we would be very much satisfied with ourselves doing that, and it would have no impact whatsoever. And I think that's probably the best thing you can do, because then you have changed nothing and you can relax. That is a very bad idea. But relaxing, I mean. And it's also like that what you said, I mean, if your investments really mean something money-wise to companies, it might be that you should consider staying in and go to the meetings and have be a part of the board and things like that, and make the best possible use of your influence to change. That's also a worthwhile endeavour. But I think it's very important that we just not focus on our feeling and how do I feel after having made this decision. Ask, what is the impact?
Well, so interestingly, the Wellcome Trust, who you may not know, one of the largest funders of medical research in the UK, have decided to stay in and engage and be a voice. Now, but when they were asked to come up with an example of where engagement had been profitable in that sense, had actually made a difference, they couldn't provide an example. So I don't know if anybody else in the audience can provide an example of where engagement changes things or has that view. Please speak up. Otherwise, I'm going to go back to you for a question. Yeah.
Can I skip on the example?
No, you have to provide it. Yes.
You're in the hot seat, Jake.
Well, if you've got the example, we'd be interested.
Many funds do not invest in tobacco. But, stubbornly, those companies are still out there producing tobacco, and it's possible to go to 100 shops in Cambridgeshire and buy cigarettes. So somehow that action in divesting from tobacco will never be invested in tobacco.
The companies exist, but people don't smoke as much.
But not because of the divestment. No. And the funds that have divested from tobacco have underperformed.
Okay, let's just hear the audience first. Yeah.
I mean, the other slightly bizarre associations that our own pension scheme here in the university and academics generally, the USS, that has BAT, British American Tobacco, as one of its top list of investments. So anyone who works in the university, you're all tobacco investors. And so that's a nice warm feeling that we can all take home. What I wanted to make is that I think all of these arguments about, do we divest or do we not, are sort of based on the moral principle, which is very, very important. But I think as we sort of debate this, the financial principle will simply take over. The International Energy Agency suggests that $48 trillion is going to be invested in new energy production in the world before 2050. And already something like 60% of that, the new energy investment, is in renewables. So my guess is that as this debate proceeds, more and more financial-based decisions will go down the route of, they won't call it divestment, they'll call it investing in the highest investment return.
Do you see the same picture? Because you seem to be arguing that we've got a long way to go. You're kind of arguing to the same points, but...
No, I think we're broadly on the same wavelength as ever. we certainly have a challenge in the terminology. Divestment's a big word, and for an institution, an investment institutions, it's often called a policy, and that means it has to be decided by the board, and that's a very formal and very important process. There's lots of governance involved, and it's difficult to change something that is a policy. You have to go around the whole circuit again and have more committees and all the rest of it. And that's not the way investors usually do things. Day to day, investors at the, if you pardon the expression, at the coalface, they just decide whether something looks like a good thing to invest in or not on the basis of financial valuations and so forth, and they can hop in and out. They don't have a big policy. They just say, well, I can invest in that if I think it's a good investment on the day, and I might invest and then hold it for 5 years, even 10 years, and then sell it again when I think it's no longer attractive. And increasingly, sorry, just to get to my point, increasingly people are doing precisely that. In other words, deciding not to invest in coal in particular, though also oil and gas, because those things just don't look like attractive investments. But it's not a big policy saying, I have divested. It's a sensible financial judgment. But the difference, of course, is that you can decide not to be invested today, and in 6 months, a year, or 5 years, given the way the market works, those things might look attractive again, in which case you can buy them again, you can invest again, and wait for the price to go up and then sell again. So the reality is that people are investing, many institutions, not all, are investing less in oil and gas and coal at the moment than they have in the past, but not on the strength of a formal divestment policy as such. So there are organisational, institutional things that come into play here.
So it sounds as if the divestment campaigners should be suspicious, perhaps, of the Glasgow statement with terms like steadily in there, because they're really just reflecting a very conservative investment process, which isn't going to make those step changes.
Well, broken record, I come back time and time again to being clear about the objective and then testing your action. I mean, to ask questions about the extent to which the university or individual colleges are really looking at the serious financial risks linked to different dimensions of climate change in the portfolio seems to me eminently sensible, and there hasn't been transparency, we don't know. It may well be that the people actually running the portfolios are quite good at it, but we don't know. But it needs to be nuanced.
Okay, so we have a question here.
Thank you. Could I just broaden the debate away a bit from the disinvestment stuff and pick up the last thing that is on the list up there? They have a duty to lead debate on energy and climate.
Would you mind saying where you're from as well?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm linked to the Climate Histories group associated with social anthropology within the university. And I raised this question at one of the earlier lectures to a group talking about past, present and future in relationship to climate change. And it's essentially, do not researchers and the university as a whole have a responsibility to be a bit more proactive in relationship to influencing local government and national government and international government? I mean, there are layers and layers, we know, of bureaucracy related to IPC and all that kind of thing. I may be misinterpreting the answer I got, but my understanding was they were basically saying our only responsibility is to collect and publish the data. We do not have a responsibility to be proactive in terms of influencing policy.
Okay, well, let's ask everybody on the panel to respond to that one. Alison first.
Perhaps I could just say that I think there's a slight muddle about the things that we've been talking about. I will answer your question in a minute. A slight muddle about divestment and the endowment portfolio and so on, and doing the research. And I'm definitely speaking from the doing the research bit and not from the divestment and investment. Excuse me. But I do think that, so to get to your question, should you influence policy, I think the first thing, certainly me as a scientist would say, is you have to collect the data. Okay, you have to publish that. And I would say that that is the most important, sort of the bedrock, because if you don't do that, you're just having a discussion which is emotional or very subjective and so on, conjectural. So I think collecting data and publishing that is a very important thing that universities do, but that's the whole point of the name of a university. We do lots of different things. And I think there is a role for universities to make some contribution to policy, but probably we don't want to get to the point where we're dictating the policy. We should be advising and providing, if you like, honest brokers in terms of saying that this is, on balance, this is what would be appropriate. Most researchers, and I would speak for myself in my particular area, I don't know how to implement an algal biofuel production facility. Okay, that's what you would need if you were going to produce algal biofuels. You would need to have a big scaled up operation. You'd have to think about investment and safety issues and all those sort of things. And as an academic, that's not the sort of thing I do. But I can certainly provide data to facilitate people deciding whether it's sustainable in terms of carbon emissions. You know, in other words, you produce more energy than you have to put in to make the fuel in the first place, and possibly also economic. And then somebody else would be somebody else, not me, would be somebody else in university, but it doesn't have to be. And I think that really it's difficult for universities to do everything and not be then lose their moral high ground, if you like, in terms of being seen as grounded in data and facts. That's from the scientific point of view.
Where would you see the initiative coming from then? Say you spot some amazing potential in your research, but nobody's tapping on your door saying, is there anything amazing that we should be doing we're not doing? Where should the initiative come from? Should you then go out and proactively seek partners, industrial partners?
Well,
or wait for them to come?
Yeah, and academics are very good at going out and trying to find funding for their research. So that's, you know, it would be great if people listen to us more than they do. I mean, within the university, there are a number of fora where people discuss and debate these things, and but I think we don't want. I personally don't want to be part of a lobby organisation which has an agenda that's pushing things forward, because I think that's for other institutions to do. I think within the university there should be enough academic freedom and recognition that solutions, particularly for things like climate change, are not black and white.
Well, I think there's a great role for academics and universities in evidence-based policy making. But it's all about coming up with evidence and the information that is needed to base this policy making on. I think what you mentioned, the IPCC, when it comes to climate change, a number of perhaps the strongest research grouping we've got at our university is what's called the Bergen Center for Climate Research, and it has provided excellent science, and it has also been able to talk to our government politicians, also providing data to the IPCC over a number of years. But I think we have to leave it to the politicians to decide upon policy. Otherwise, we would probably lose our credibility as scientists. And it's also a threat to democracy, isn't it? Because if it's not the political institutions that really make the decisions, you can end up in a bureaucracy or a state where the bureaucrats or the technocrats has a huge impact. So I think it's important that we provide as much as we can. We can influence, but it has to be the politicians that decide on these issues at the end of the day. Otherwise, you wouldn't really know who to make responsible, to blame. Yes.
Good. So, Nikki, proactive researchers in policy making or not?
As ever, I think it depends a little bit what you mean by the words. Personally, I think we should be proactive in influencing policy. In my working world, which is criminal justice, I personally think I have a duty to speak out, and that it would be wrong if I think that the government is getting things wrong in prisons just to think that I can keep quiet about it. But then this public engagement varies. I've got colleagues who are much better at doing real good quality empirical research than I am. I perhaps a bit better at talking about things about which I don't know, as in this afternoon. I therefore have to be shut up to talk about what I do know about, which is go back in my box and talk about criminal justice. So I think within the university there has to be scope for all these areas. Public engagement is a buzz term, and I think it is really important, and I don't think I can complain about national sentencing policy if I'm not prepared to speak out about what's wrong with it.
Very nice power.
Yeah.
Good. Did you want to contribute?
Well, I mean, I think that dimension of personal responsibility applies to all of us, academics or in any other field of endeavour. But the notion of evidence, collecting an evidence base is interesting, it seems to me, in that an institution like a university has, particularly in this day and age, choices that have to be made about not so much what kind of evidence as evidence about what should be collected, or the collection of which should be encouraged. There are funding issues, inevitably, and decisions about departments that should be established or should be quietly allowed to go. And again, it comes back, I suppose, to thinking about objectives and the mission. And Cambridge University's mission is to contribute to society through the pursuit of education, learning and research. There's also a reference to a concern for sustainability in the relationship with the environment. So I think it would be an interesting discussion to be had about what the nature of the contribution is that the University of Cambridge feels it's appropriate to make, and how that is articulated and communicated, and how the sustainability dimension ranks, as it were, in the order of those decisions about what kind of evidence to collect about what.
Okay. Sounds like Cambridge can get a research institute.
Well, it's already got the Conservation
Institute. Does
Institute.
that answer your question than when you put it this afternoon?
Yes, I mean, what I'm frightened about is that the data, to a large extent, is already there. I think the policymakers in government have the data, and as we know, the current government, and that's not a criticism of this particular government that I'm advising, virtually all of the advisors, are backtracking. And that's what frightens me. And the people who really know, it was a very frightening talk, the past, present and future. It actually just feel these are the people who really know the stuff.
And they're not being heard. Yeah. Okay. I think there was a question at the back. Yes.
Several asked me to organise a dressing room previously to return their degrees based around these issues that we've been talking about. And I was just wondering whether this is something that we should be worried about, and I guess whether it's something that's taken into consideration of the opinions of the people at our institute, the universities around the countries, I guess, and whether these are taken into consideration. And like you said, you felt that there wasn't enough pressure from the students, but is that something that should be necessary? Should the university itself be actually asking these questions, rather than waiting for the students to start asking them themselves?
I think the university is a collection of individuals, and that you have to start with individuals. One of the things that I'm slightly embarrassed about sitting here today is I'm not an expert on the environment, and I am in the next few weeks taking a number of flights on behalf of the university and the college, and I didn't really ask myself whether this was a sensible thing to do. I was asked to do it, I'm doing it. Now, this reducing my carbon footprint, I'm embarrassed. Should I not be sitting here because I'm about to be flying around various places in the next few weeks? So asking the question personally is a really important one. I think it's a mistake to say the university is something out there. The university is a collection of human beings.
There's probably an ethical committee you can consult within the university about the carbon footprint. I'm sure there is. Did you have a question? I'm sorry, I must have missed you there.
No, it was just adding to the points we were making before. And everybody, all the researchers collect their data together, but they're not expected to sit on it and do nothing with it. I just wanted to point out, I'm in archaeology, by the way, and a lot of my work involves assisting with the preparation of major research grants. Every major funding body demands that you justify your research with public impact. So they want to know what you're going to do with that sets of data, how you're going to make it public, and how you're going to use it to influence policy So the ultimate goal is to demonstrate that direct link between your research and influencing policy. So what greater way to influence it than by increasing climate change, which is one of the major research topics within the university.
Alison, does that impact section of the grant application?
Yes.
Do you interpret it differently? Or?
No, I think it's very important. I think one of the things that we should bear in mind, and I always try to instill this in people, is that we're taking taxpayers' money to do research, to have fun. I think that's what Dad was saying when we do our research, and we have to justify it. I think to go back to your point about we have the data and people should act on that. I think on a high level we have the data, and if it was completely obvious how to act on it, I think it would be unreasonable that politicians weren't doing something about it. The fact that they're not isn't entirely because they are self-seeking, money-grubbing, whatever, if that's your opinion of them. But rather, it isn't obvious what to do, necessarily. I think that's the difficulty. So in terms of the impact statements, or the pathways to impact, they're called in our field, getting people to think about how their research, done as an individual, could contribute to the greater good is very important. And I think there has been a sea change in the last sort of 10 to 15 years to get people to actually articulate that. But I would say that much of the research that's done is not going to have, in the scientific side, is not going to have an immediate impact without there being input from the stakeholders and industry as well. So it's not going to be academics who are going to be, as I was saying before, who are going to be rolling out all the technologies. It's got to be taken by industry or by government, or combination of both, in order to be able to implement those. I don't think we should be turning into, factories that
not factories, but could you be a catalyst in the chain that provokes it?
Yes, but I think we do try to do that. The difficulty is that you want to be able to be slightly more objective than you would be if you were then promoting your particular sprocket that would solve a particular problem. In order to continue providing the scientific evidence to support whatever you're investigating.
Okay, so I'm going to ask Runa to contribute one final point. This is your last call for questions because we're drawing to an end, so one more chance to put your hand up. Runa, did you want to?
Yes, well, I think there's a lot of data when it comes to climate change, and there was a report quite recently by the International Energy Agency stating that the CO2 emissions has leveled off in 2015. We know a lot about what the climate model says about the 2-degree goal and things like that. So there is loads of data, and that's important, obviously. But I think when it comes to these global or societal challenges, global challenges that climate change represents, I think it is important also for us as researchers to see that one of these arguments, or one line of arguments, like do we meet or do we not meet the 2-degree level and things like that. I mean, by the way, it's a political ambition, the 2-degree. We do not whether that would respect biodiversity or something like that. There's huge number of unsolved questions. And then, of course, it's not only, let's say, the natural sciences approach to it. You need to understand how legislation, how politics, how the finance models impact on this. So I think we need to embrace cross-disciplinary research to a much larger extent. Otherwise, we can throw onto the table numbers and data, and nothing will actually happen.
Okay, so we're back where we started, with climate change becoming an economic and political issue rather than an environmental one. And we're back for our final question to our original question asker. Go ahead. And then...
I was just wondering, also picking up on some of the points about academic freedom and impact of research and who will go out beneath the industry. Because earlier in 2014, science writer Alison put in a freedom of information request to Cambridge University because the university had signed a collaborative research framework with Shell. And she wasn't allowed to know what the sort of details of that was. Part of the response was to read it was from the university placing the details of complex agreement of this nature into the public domain would prejudice the university's ability to negotiate similar frameworks with other companies, etc., etc. So there seems to be a clear sort of conflict between not knowing what the terms of this agreement is, whether that might compromise both freedom of academic freedom in terms of what that actually means, and also whether that actually goes against a lot of the other commitments of the university in terms of climate change and not taking care of the environment. So I'm just wondering what the comment of panel would be to that.
So you haven't actually framed a question there, but do you feel the university has an obligation, or do individual colleges have an obligation to be more transparent than they apparently seem to be in the face of requests for openness about collaborations with the fossil fuel industry?
I think you raise an enormous question about the political economy in which we live, the market economy or whatever. As I said at the beginning, I feel quite ignorant in many ways of this subject, but I commend to you all Oxfam's Better Returns in a Better World, which I think raises some interesting questions and a few answers.
But will you be commending that to the university authorities as well? I think you will, as a master of one of the colleges.
I'm sure that all interested people have read it. Hands up who in this room has already read this. Probably half of you have.
So you're better informed than they are.
Could I counter commend,
Yep.
or additionally commend, something produced by the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership called, Jake, remind me of the title of the piece we did? The Value of Responsible Investment, which discusses many of these issues.
Which is a production of the University of Cambridge.
Within the University of Cambridge.
Any other reading matters? I think we are at an end, so thank you everybody for your contributions.
Flying's a difficult one, isn't it?
Flying's a really